to M.I.Cynic. Today, I have the pleasure in inviting one of the leading experts, I would say, today on Afghanistan, and somebody who I admire and appreciate very greatly, none other than Mr. Irfan Yar. I actually got wind of Irfan Yar by coincidence when I was watching a webinar last month on the Global Counterterrorism Institute, and I was watching some of his previous interviews on Afghanistan that immediately captured my attention. And so I'm very, very happy to have you on board with the show today, and of course to be speaking about a subject that's very near and dear to your heart in more ways than one, which is of course Afghanistan. So without further ado, maybe we could start just with a very light, brief overview. I know you've got a lot to speak about where you started academically and where you are now.
Well, first, thank you so much, Thomas, for having me here and for your kind and excellent introduction. So in terms of my academic background, I started developing, interest in security studies because I was more influenced by what was going on back in my country, Afghanistan. I lived there. I lived in Pakistan. So the situation on the ground, was very, conflict driven and all those things. So it made me curious to pursue something in security. And then I did my BA honors in political science in India, and subsequently international relation and area studies, where I specifically focused on South Asia, to be more specific on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I was also working, in the same stream in security. And then I moved to Canada, also, did my second master's in international affairs with a focus on, again, on security and conflict, and hopefully to pursue my PhD in the same stream.
Is this a big, I know that here in the West, in my studies and in my work, it's still quite new in many ways. I think 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't really, you'd be hard pressed to find a OSINT private intelligence job, or even academically speaking, it was very hush-hush for a long time. And is this something that is gaining a lot of traction, the study of intelligence, employment in intelligence?
I would say yes, and one of the reasons that this study is attracting more attention and scope is the role of think tank and India's involvement in countries like Afghanistan, and in some countries, there are driven by conflict in Africa, and the think tank community there is much active, in promoting India's interest to be engaging in those conflict-driven areas. And partially, the intelligence is also important to India because of its own volatile situation, specifically talking about Kashmir, where, intelligence really matter. And of course, it's neighboring state Pakistan. So they are, they would never let intelligence, shrinks up, because it is something which is really right. Critical to their.
Would you say almost that India doesn't have the luxury of treating intelligence as a faraway thing, or it really is a matter of right next door, and India is very much in a contested. Not just obviously the Middle East immediately to the west of the country, but of course you have China, Southeast Asia. Really it's almost sitting on a hotspot of intelligence activity.
Yeah. So for India, intelligence is not an option. This is a requirement and a critical thing for its own survival. Specifically, as you mentioned, it has China, with which it has a very volatile relation. Pakistan, obviously, and even the events in Afghanistan can also have consequences on India's national security.
Now, you were quite young, I believe, when you made the decision to study Afghanistan. What made you decide to take such a deep dive into the country, more or less completely? What made you decide to Afghanistan, of all places?
Well, this is very interesting, story and a journey. So when we were in Pakistan in a refugee camp, I'm not sure if you heard about the FATA region, which is considered to one of the most, conflict and dangerous zone. It's a border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where all those mujahideen and jihadists, have their safe haven. And I was living, in that area. And, to be honest with you, even in my school, there were people and who would, like ask student, to join the training camps and go to Afghanistan for jihad. And for 2 times, I mean, I was very young that time, like kid. And my father, thanks to him, he would tell us, don't listen to these people, these radical people. I would sometimes argue with them that why jihad, should be waged in Afghanistan. There are Muslims, even the people. I mean, why jihad should come at all? So they would tell me that you are deviated from the path of Islam, and then they would discourage me, to stick to that decision. So that endpoints, but again, if you see the surrounding there, it's a very backward area, even the Pakistanis, there were also state-sponsored, kind of radical. For example, in my school, if you could see the curriculum, there was one topic, Islamic studies, in which they would brought a very controversial chapter from Quran, which is called Surah Al-Ahzab and Surah Al-Anfal, and they specifically talk about, the fight and wars between Muslim and non-Muslim. And for students who are in, third and fourth grade and studying that chapter would leave a very head red, an image full of hate, specifically of the Western people. And we would taught that in the school. So, and those were certain things, which made me curious why there is war, why there is jihad. And this is how I, start taking interest in politics.
Yeah, for what seems to me for a very personal experience with very complicated topics and with ramifications that go beyond the personal and quite possibly to society at large. So, well, thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's a great segue into Afghanistan Today, and one of the principal reasons why I thought it would be great to have you on the show now is, of course, what's happening right now in the news in Afghanistan. So for those in my audience who may not be completely up to date with what's going on, I have a short little incident here which I thought was very interesting when I was looking through the notes, that on the 7th of March of this year, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken had a letter addressed to President Ghani of Afghanistan, and it was leaked. It presents 4 suggestions for the Afghan peace process, and this was the start of the so-called Biden leak, which made its rounds through Twitter, and which opens up, of course, the door to a series of events leading to the decision to withdraw US troops in Afghanistan. Then, henceforth, on the 12th, there was another leaked documents from the State Department, more or less the same thing here with the leaks that are happening place. I find this very interesting, these high-profile leaks, and one of the things I wanted to ask you was, it seems almost very timely that there was these leaks, and then sometime afterwards there was a high-profile decision made by the Biden government. Is there a link there? I mean, is it quite convenient, would you say, for these leaks to prep an international audience for what was to come as a withdrawal after 20 years on the ground?
I think, first of all, if we talk about the leak, why it happened, such high-profile documents, which could decide potentially the fate of Afghan people, and the country as a whole, later or soon, these documents had to come to the public domain. Specifically, it leaked in Afghanistan, not in the US. So it also represents partially the capability of I would say, the weakness of the Afghan intelligence, that they were not able to keep that in secret. It also says that the Afghan press has, the press media has considerable amount of, freedom of speech, because without, taking care of the government secret, they expose us to the public. So I think it should be something appreciated of the Afghan media. And third, as I mentioned, that both countries are democratic, Afghanistan and the US. And the people constitutionally have the right to know. And again, if such documents which can directly influence people's lives, I think they should come to public domain. But I think as analysts, we should be more concerned about what are the consequences and what are, in those documents. And as you mentioned, that this is something, which is directly related to the people of Afghanistan, because in this document the Americans says that Ashraf Ghani should cooperate with the Taliban so that the slow and pooky Afghan peace process can speed up and they can reach a potential mutual agreement. So I think this is very critical time to be discussed that topic.
Yes, and well, thank you for sharing that. I can't agree with you more. This is something that for me is also a very interesting situation that I think it certainly took me by surprise. A war that has lasted 20 years following the attacks on September the 11th. It cost 2,300 American lives, and what I would assume was many more Afghan lives, although I don't have the number with me, let alone the damage that's been caused through families and households in Afghanistan and beyond. It has been the start of the global war on terror, which is still ongoing. And I think after 20 years of this document, whether the Taliban and the Afghan government reaching what was a mutual pact, right? This was agreed nominally, although I'd like to ask you about that a bit later. Is it a positive step for peace in the region after 20 years?
Yeah, the U.S., it's been 20 years the U.S. been fighting the Taliban and its allies. U.S. has spent, trillions of dollars. I would say I read one of the documents that mentioned that the U.S. spent $3 trillion, and thousands of U.S. and Afghan lives were lost. So despite all these, 20 years war, trillions of dollars, and huge, massive, human casualties, the United States could not defeat the Taliban, neither it achieved its goal in Afghanistan. And the only thing that they say is that killed Osama bin Laden. So like really, like one person could worth, this much cost from the U.S. and the Afghan government. It's like not convincing. So the U.S., in some ways has admitted its defeat. And just a few weeks ago, Biden also says that no amount of the U.S. soldier could bring peace and stability to Afghanistan, and it was also not their objective, to go there and stabilize Afghanistan. So it suggests that U.S. never intended, to go there and bring stability to the country. What they wanted is to eradicate threat which would pose, a threat to the U.S. national security. So obviously, and now that the U.S. has decided, to leave Afghanistan, I would say irresponsibly, it is like a good decision, at least now, because we cannot say there was a best option, but we should always talk relatively. So relatively, the U.S. troops and other international troops leaving Afghanistan was relatively a good decision, because if they would stay further, the Taliban, are very straight in their decision, and they said we will wage war, we will even intensify war, be it Afghan government or on the U.S. And of course, there would be more casualties, more threat to the neighboring countries, and of course Afghan government itself. So I think we shall still hope for the best, and this was the best possible decision that the Biden administration took.
Yes, I think it's one of the most interesting things for an analyst, for a political analyst, is the vast difference in the response that we have seen at the initial start of the war versus what we see now. And of course, we're talking about two different presidents from two different political parties, and 20 years in between, the world has changed. But even so, it's remarkably interesting how unideological the Biden administration has been in approaching Afghanistan. We are not talking about a commitment at all costs. We are not talking about democracy at all costs and installing regimes. We're almost seeing what is a flat-out admission that you know what, we couldn't install our version of government and democracy in Afghanistan. We couldn't even defeat the enemy that we declared war on after 9/11. And in fact, we are going to even want the Taliban to be, provisionally a part of Afghanistan's future, whether that be in the shape of, official governance or not. And I think it's quite startling to see that difference. Why do you think that is? Why are we seeing such an incredibly different posture from the US government 20 years into this war? And why are we not seeing more of that initial wave of enthusiasm following the Bush administration's declaration?
Well, again, if we see to the situation on the ground, it's about the reality on the ground, who has upper hand. And based on that decision, I think from the beginning, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, so there were within few weeks, they wiped out the Taliban regime and, killed around 12,000 Taliban members. And for the 2 years, situation was pretty normal. Nobody could imagine, that the Taliban will re-emerge as an insurgency. But soon after, 6 years in 2005, the Taliban re-emerge a very stark and resilient force, and they mount heavy casualty in American forces, and that was a big realization for the US, especially when Obama came to power and he started talking to the Taliban. And it was during his time when the Qatar office of the Taliban was established with cooperation from Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan, because the U.S. admitted that they were taking heavy casualties of their forces, and the war was going nowhere. So from there, they decided that they should leave Afghanistan, but they were always looking for a good opportunity when it should be the right time. So they waited and hoped for a better situation to leave Afghanistan, but it never happened until now. And even Biden also said that the situation is not going to improve, and we cannot wait for the hope that Afghanistan will get better, or for an ideal situation so that they can withdraw their troops. So from the beginning, the Taliban were very strong because they knew what was how to mobilize basically the Afghan people. One of the mistakes that US made was when they invaded Afghanistan, they did not take the Afghan people as their strategic audience. So what the US did was, they just took in confidence a very small group, which we call, the Northern Alliance, who were at one point the sworn enemies of the Taliban. And that was a very limited and small group. And the American usually ignored the Afghan people. What did the Taliban did? They pushed a counter, insurgency operation with taking the Afghan people, in their confidence. So they established very close relation with the Afghan people, especially in the rural Afghanistan, and they convinced them that the U.S. has come here to destroy your religion, your culture, your property. And it was the cooperation from the people on the ground that made and granted the Taliban a very significant strength.
And is that why? Do you think that failure by the US command to secure the popular support for the cause has meant that instead large chunks, a significant portion of the Afghanistan's population went on to support the Taliban, which in turn meant that the Taliban could rebuild stronger, more resilient, and today undefeated?
Well, yeah, like the US, of course, no matter how knowledge they gain in Afghanistan's society, they would always be not sufficient, in order to deal with the situation on the ground here. And the Taliban, utilize their Pashtun knowledge, they capitalize on this knowledge because they knew what would anger the local Afghan. And US made huge mistakes in rural Afghanistan. They would raid the Afghan people home. They would violate the Parda system, which we call it, the privacy of Afghan women. here in the West, like, we don't care if you're a male and you are searching a woman's body in terms of security. It's very normal. But back there, it is considered to be a huge, dishonor for the family. And in order to regain their honor in that society, they must, take revenge and, or die while trying, revenge. These are very, like, the facts that usually are ignored by the practitioner and policymaker. And thanks to academia, where, they would, dig deep into this, kind of facts which rarely matter on the ground. So those kind of things, those mistakes were exploited by the Taliban as a huge sources of propaganda. They would take the picture of, of such situation where a U.S. soldier would, search woman body and poster on the local areas. For example, let me narrate one poster. The Taliban says that, "Oh, Afghan people, do you have honor? The American soldier are, violating the privacy of Afghan women, and you are still silent. So come and join us." And those propaganda, those Afghan people are very, I would say, naive, especially in rural areas. So they would always see what's happening on the ground. They don't understand the Western culture or all those things. So what is more appealing for them, they would always go, and join that party. And obviously that was the Taliban, who were more more culturally close, more linguistically close, and they would defend their culture.
I believe that there was a similar situation in Vietnam, and I mean the parallels are almost so difficult to ignore. The story writes itself in as far as the failure to listen and to garner the authentic support of the population in question. I think immediately one of the questions that rises is whether the United States can win a long, protracted, guerrilla-style war, and whether we're not just witnessing in Iraq and in Afghanistan a repeat of the same era from a tactical perspective. And I think that's a very interesting question. Do you think there was another way forward? Do you think the United States could have achieved a different result in Afghanistan, and how would that be? How would that have been done, and what would Afghanistan look today if that were the case?
Well, this is a very complex answer, but again, seeing the whole picture and analyzing the current situation, one might say that the Americans are coming to the same point where they start the war. For example, they came here to kill Osama bin Laden, and now they are going without achieving their aim. So admittedly, it was a defeat. And now, in the best possible scenario would be, for example, if the notorious, attack on World Trade Center happened 9/11. Even the Taliban says that we said, okay, we want to negotiate. Please don't wage war in Afghanistan. Today, the Taliban representative in Doha says the same thing. So why, you made that mistake, and now you wasted like millions of dollars, lives of people, and why you didn't listen to us at that time? If you could listen to us that time, nothing would have happened. So I think the best option would be if that thing was solved by mutual agreement, mutual negotiation. Maybe the Taliban would agree, okay, we will hand over Osama bin Laden to you. But Bush administration, never waited for this moment. He right away securitized the issue and, invaded,
yes,
war in Afghanistan. I think that might not be the only case. There might have been some other incentives that the U.S. waged war on Afghanistan, and not only Osama bin Laden.
Well, I'm not sure how much of the thinking back in 2001 concluded that there would be a short, easy war, bomb them back to the Stone Age, and by 2003, 2004, mission accomplished, and then everybody's back home. And I wonder if now we've come to a point that the powers that be in the U.S. military realize that before jumping into a war within a faraway country with a different culture, you might be tempted to, as you say, negotiate first, especially if you have willing willing participants on the other side.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was a huge miscalculation of the U.S. As you rightly mentioned, that they would thought, we'll just go topple the Taliban regime and come back, within a few years. But I think they forgot the Afghanistan history. It is considered to be, the graveyard of the empires. Once you are driven there and the conflicts, it is extremely difficult, to live back from that country. Geography, of course, rule in Afghanistan. The terrain is favored by for the guerrilla and not for the conventional forces. So obviously the guerrilla will have offer him, there. So I think it was a huge miscalculation, and now the United States is realizing, realizing its mistake that. Because of relying on one group, which we call again the Northern Alliance, who made biased decision based on the Taliban. They didn't realize Afghanistan history, and the situation is totally different now.
And I think you're absolutely right. One of the most interesting elements of this is, as you say, Afghanistan, going into the Afghanistan war, there was already the reputation of this so-called graveyard of empires. The United States perhaps decided not to pay heed to this. And I think another question that comes out, a very interesting question for us as analysts, is the study of how much one can be led to believe that because you have an upper hand in technology, in the power to wage war over a long distance with the latest in military hardware, with highly efficient and trained troops, you name it, and on the other hand, the timeless features of perhaps geography, of a different culture, of needing to secure a public support and not being able to get it. So how do you rate this miscalculation that decided to favor the power of technology and downplay perhaps all of these other traditional aspects of war? Did that come into the equation of the U.S. military, and were they shocked to discover that perhaps they miscalculated just how important these features are?
I think they did not realize that by then. They were overconfident, with their technology, with their military power, and of course the most powerful, military machinery, the NATO and its members. And again, if we see the Vietnam War, Vietnam was also, militarily and technology inferior when compared to the US, but what they had was support on the ground. And of course, you are most powerful when you are fighting on a ground that you have, the full knowledge of. Mm-hmm. But when you go to a foreign land, you are not familiar with its culture, its tradition, and specifically in the countries like Afghanistan, which is a tribal region, everything there is being played, with specific, tribal values. And the US has very limited knowledge of that. So again, it was a miscalculation of the US intelligence. They 100% relied on their military power and not the non-traditional aspect of security, which always play a critical role in insurgency in every war. And of course, no matter how advanced you are in terms of technology and military weapon, but if you do not have popular support or support from the people, you are very more likely to lose the war. And this has been the case in Vietnam, and in the Middle East, and of course in Afghanistan.
Another point that I find very interesting to add to the debate here is one made by the CIA Director William Burns, who told the US senators recently that the ability to collect intelligence threats on Afghanistan will diminish with a US military withdrawal. I think that comes without any question. But we know as well that Osama bin Laden did some training of recruits and some planning on Afghanistani soil. So with this admission, we now have to prepare for a world in which Afghanistan might be a safe haven once again for this kind of radicalization and for planning on faraway targets. What is your opinion on Afghanistan being the safe haven tomorrow? Is it likelier now that the US is withdrawing its troops from the ground or not?
Well, this is a legit and a burning question, which should be raised. And I think the best and simple answer is we don't know yet. But again, like as an analyst, when we analyze the situation and look at the big picture, we would say that this is my personal opinion, that the Afghanistan will not become a safe haven, at least in the coming 5 to 10 years, because what we see there in Afghanistan, the potential, rise up ISK and Al Qaeda. If we look at the ISK or the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is, a local branch of the ISIS for the Afghanistan and the Indian subcontinent region, they are very weak now. So, and they are, competing with the Taliban in terms of, gaining influence and territory. And the Taliban have, anchored them a very, bloody nose. So they are very less likely, to re-emerge as a powerful terrorist group. And so their relationship is also very clear that the Taliban do not want them, because their agenda is more global, which doesn't suit the Taliban agenda, because the Taliban only want to have dominance in Afghanistan, and they don't care what's going on outside the world. So for that reason, it's very clear, the relation. But when it comes to Al Qaeda, it's more complicated, because Al Qaeda and Taliban have been cooperating with each other, since the emergence of the Taliban movement in 1990s. And now that the United States has, started diplomatic relation with the Taliban, and also put, pressure on the Taliban to cut its ties with international terrorists such as Al Qaeda. The Taliban also says that we will cut ties with them. They also, if we see the Doha Taliban peace agreement, they also agreed that they will not let any individual group or terrorist group, use soil of Afghanistan against the U.S. threat. So the Taliban, what else can they do? They had given their words on a piece of paper, which is, of course, an official agreement. And this is that we are not going to cooperate with them or let them use Afghan soil against the U.S. So that also kind of, suggests that the Taliban will, not let any international terrorists, stay in Afghanistan. I think what should be more concerned, and you should take care of, which U.S. has ignored, as the rise of the old rivalry, like domestically. There were groups in Afghanistan, who were opposing the Taliban from the beginning. And I think once the Taliban leave, there are chances that it will be those groups, who might take, to the weapons and, start civil war in some sense. So that should be more concerning rather than, rather than the terrorists.
Right, which is something similar to what we've seen as well in Iraq, that a withdrawal that happens too early will actually leave all of these factions under immediate strain. And this is something that's often overlooked, or perhaps the political will is so high to just get the troops out as quickly as possible that there's almost no thought paid to the ramifications.
Exactly. In Afghanistan, this feature is even more prominent because of its historical relation, among those groups. If we look back into the history when the Soviet troops, withdrew from Afghanistan, so there was a political vacuum created, and all those, jihadist faction, which were calling themselves the Mujahideen, who were also insurgent at one point, they, turned their guns against each other. And they dragged the country into a bloody civil war. And it was the Taliban, who emerged and put an end to the lawlessness of that era. And they were very popular, especially in the initial years, because they brought, peace, stability, and law and order. But subsequently, of course, their image changed because they imposed very strict interpretation of Islam. And those jihadist groups who were destroyed by the Taliban, they cooperated with the United States, to dislodge the Taliban regime. And when the United States toppled the Taliban regime, so those specific groups who were the enemies of the Taliban were given the lion's share in the subsequent government, which came to existence in the Bonn Agreement. And and so now, and the government, these are the people who were at once, the sworn enemies of the Taliban. So now the Taliban are coming to power, and they see their enemies, and use, anything against the Taliban for 20 years. Of course, they will be having some, intention.
Do you think this is an issue that might come up? I mean, what do you rate is the likelihood of these factions, these old rivalries, as you call them, coming to a boiling point?
Yes, maybe not in a fashion where it was like open civil war, but again, in the Afghan government, there are many elements who try to keep the Taliban away from joining governments, because they think if the Taliban come to power, their interests are going to be wasted, because the Taliban will not let them rule Afghanistan. And there have been many warlords. I would say they never want the Taliban to come to power, first because of their personal interest and because of their ideology also. Right. And they constantly advocate, and they can be called, the spoiler of the peace talks.
Right. And I think the United States diplomats and military command would be well to heed your words, because how can we talk about peace if the minute that we leave, whatever nice things and whatever thoughtful things that you laid out will immediately come under pressure from these factions within. I think it's important that any comprehensive peace deal takes the peace of Afghanistan as a whole into consideration. And that might be very hard to do when we're talking about a nation 20 years fractured by war. But do you think the appetite for peace by the Afghani population might be stronger than these old rivalries coming to a fray?
For the 20 years, the Afghan people, the civilians, are always at the receiving end. They are, living a life, a dirt poor life. They are just, begging for food, and they really don't care, like speaking from my experience and situation, they really don't care who really controls the power. What they want is peace. Like their thirst for peace is that much that they really don't care, be they the Taliban or the current Afghan government. What they want is, to stop the violence and live a peaceful lives. But unfortunately, the Afghan people, cannot do anything, because they are always busy, and finding, bread and butter for themselves. They are, even if we talk about the democratic procedure, it's very unfortunate to say that we have, a very corrupt Afghan government, because even when the elections are taking place, it is not transparent at all. So that's the only power where citizens can, utilize that strength in a democracy, and that power is also taken from them de facto. So the Afghan people cannot do anything, because they are taken by the warlords and the current Afghan government.
I think one of the fascinating developments that we've seen over the course of these 20 years in Afghanistan is diplomatic relations between the United States and the Taliban. Something that for me is still quite shocking and unthinkable, myself having grown up through 9/11. I remember as a schoolboy the teachers wheeling in the television sets, and we were watch these horrific scenes that seemed like a movie, almost like a horrible movie. And to think 20 years later, and we're talking about diplomatic relations between the US and Taliban is still hard to believe. As part of this peace deal, of course, the United States has the intention of using Pakistan as a source for its airstrikes and drone capabilities, something that would have as well seemed like something out of a fiction movie to me back in the days of 2001. But these are both things that we have to contend with now, very, very real sense in 2021. However, I wonder whether new is always better and whether new is always the best path forward. Newness didn't much help the United States in 20 years in Afghanistan. I wonder, do you think the United States is also making the same mistake in assuming that new technology in drones and airstrikes will allow it to successfully monitor and counter any rising terrorist threat or any domestic instability within Afghanistan?
No. It certainly is not going to work, because the United States, when it was militarily engaged in Afghanistan in the 20 years, so they, never hesitated to use the drone. So they always used the drone. And beside drones, of course, there was other, military might present in Afghanistan. So combine these two factors didn't work. How would one factor, using drone work? This is a very common sense. Second, the drone strike, in my personal opinion and the knowledge that I have gained, studies also suggested that the drone attack always created more bad than goods, because usually there was a very poor coordination between the operator and intelligence on the ground. So mostly they would target, gathering such as in mass people coming together or a wedding in rural areas, and they would be the targeted. And the people would, the civilians, and they would, feel very frustrated, and they provided, they pushed them to join the Taliban. And one reason was that in rural Afghanistan, it is very common that people will carry, a long beard and an outfit which exactly look like the Taliban. The outlook and the appearance. So a normal person cannot differentiate who is Taliban and who is a normal village person. And they would, take them for the Taliban and kill those, civilians. So that has always created more, frustration and anger among the civilians rather than, doing the good things. So, the drone technology is a big failure, in Afghanistan.
So we've talked a lot about things that can go wrong, and certainly things that have gone wrong. Yeah. But if this withdrawal is going to come with more problems than solutions, Irfan, then I'd love to have your opinion on what is an effective solution after 20 years of failures and 20 years of setbacks and 20 years of not exactly getting Afghanistan to where the world would like to see Afghanistan. Will Afghanistan always be doomed to these repetitive cycles, this graveyard of empires, this new terrorist radicalization groups? What can we do about this? How can we secure Afghanistan?
So for the lesson that we learned from 20 years of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the first lesson is that military is not the solution to Afghanistan. This is a proven fact that the most powerful military might do not bring peace and stability to Afghanistan, vis-a-vis a very weak power, the Taliban, who mostly relied on the weapons from 1950s. So military is not going to work at all. I think the other lesson that we should learn is that the US should, find non-military solution. So a non-military solution comes, of course, economic development. I think I always say this, it's not about, to eradicate terrorists. It is about, to eradicate terrorism. And terrorists can be died, but terrorism is always in the minds of people. So, until you change the situation, the ideology, and the mind of the people, you really cannot eradicate radicalism, terrorism, or extremism. And for that, to eradicate or root radicalism, root the radicalism out of people's mind, you should adopt a long-term approach. Education is the best way, because in rural Afghanistan, where most of the population reside, they have very, limited access to basic utilities of the life, even water, health, normal, daily wages, education, and all these things matter. For example, an educated person is less likely to join, speaking, in large, the terrorism or radical groups. As I told you about my personal background, I was one of those school kids, and my classmate would go and join the terrorist group. So had I been in that region for a long time, I would be one of them. But luckily, I went away from that, backward region and to the city, Kabul, and that situation influenced me. So it was my family background, the circumstances that I lived in, also play a big role. And I think socioeconomic condition, again, the corruptness of the Afghan government. One of the bizarre fact that I should admit is the Afghan government has created a huge gap between the people and the Afghan government. And people are very disappointed and frustrated from the Afghan government because they are not providing, or they are incapable of providing them facilities. And the Taliban, in fact, in many rural areas come to the front and offering people, help, and, which make them, more close to the people. So again, to conclude, education, spending, are making a huge investment in the Afghan infrastructure, economic development, providing, employment to the people, would help, curb radicalism in Afghanistan.
So would you go so far as to suggest that where the government disappears is where the Taliban appears? Is there a link to be made there between the failure of policies backed, or maybe policies that take the social good into consideration and are meant for the prosper of the people? Where that fails is where we actually see the rise of radicalization.
We cannot exactly establish a boundary where the government disappears, the Taliban will appear, because the failure of the government is one of the key factors, not all the factor. Of course, we also have there is always, foreign involvement. So, realistically speaking, foreign countries such as specifically Pakistan has played a very crucial role in the development of Afghanistan. So the United States should not only think of the domestic politics, talking about the government structure, but also, take their non-NATO allies such as Pakistan, convince them, to not interfere in Afghanistan because of their proxy war, which they think, related to India. So both domestic and foreign involvement, are necessary to be addressed in order to end this conflict.
Which other countries can Afghanistan count among its friends today? And what role do they have in its future?
In Afghanistan, of course, the sole supporter of Afghanistan is the US, who almost, exclusively funding its budget. The other key supporter in the region that Afghanistan relies is on India. And I think one of the biggest mistake Afghanistan make, especially in its diplomacy, they always, try, they cannot make balance between its neighboring. So either they will tilt toward India or they will tilt toward Pakistan. And unfortunately, they have failed, to keep a balance. And nowadays, specifically, in the post-Taliban government, the Afghanistan has failed, to engage with Pakistan diplomatically. And the Pakistan, realistically speaking, is powerful than Afghanistan. And if it see Afghanistan as a threat, even if it is not, because of India, it will always, find excuses, to sneak into Afghanistan and, start their covert operation. There are, as I mentioned, many elements in Afghan government who have personal enmity with Pakistan. And because of personal relation, they want to, to keep Pakistan away and give more, more way and influence to Indian government in Afghanistan, which I think is not the right approach. The right approach would be to keep balance and always prioritize Afghan national interests.
Do you think we might be looking at a situation in the future that, should the Afghanistan government fail to establish strong connections with their Pakistani counterparts, that we might see that the Taliban might view this as a situation in which they could strengthen those links themselves and almost set up a shadow government clearly backed by Pakistan and the official government more closely aligned to India? Is this at all in the realm of possibility?
Yes, just let's consider if the Taliban come to power, they are more likely to establish strong relationship with the Pakistan than India. Has been historically the case, and one reason is because Pakistan sheltered the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. So obviously, they had to pay them back. They will always, but apparently the Taliban says, that they will always have good relationship with all the countries, be it India, Pakistan, or whoever they are. But realistically, Pakistan is going to gain more influence when Taliban come back to power.
And we might see the start of a new geopolitical triangle of relations between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and possibly Iraq, Iran. It could get a whole lot more complicated now with perhaps with a more fully independent Afghanistan.
Yeah. But the optimistic point here is the Taliban have also learned from their mistakes in the past. They were very in the loggerheads, especially with Iran. They were almost, when the Taliban killed the diplomatic, crew of Iran. So the Taliban, now put more emphasis on, having good relationship with all their neighbors. And this is, I think, a very good development in the ideology of the Taliban, at least in their leadership. So even when the Taliban come to power, I think they will maintain good relationship than they had previously.
Of course, I think back in 2001 at the start of the US-Afghanistan war, a few people could have predicted that we might have an Afghanistan government 20 years from now. But I think it leads to a more interesting question, which is if the Taliban will accumulate power, perhaps more of a share of the power than the official Afghanistan government, and perhaps even come to dominate Afghanistani politics. You mentioned that the Taliban has come a long way in 20 years. Should the world give the Taliban a new start, a fresh chance?
I think that's the only option, There's the only option that they should, let the Taliban join the government, because they are an integral part of the Afghan society. This was also one of the lessons, that the Taliban cannot be, kept away from the Afghan society. They always, they should remember that they have, huge support in the rural Afghanistan. It's the media, which doesn't really cover the Taliban support, So I think this is the only option. I wish we had, a better option, that the Taliban should not be given power, and had there been some other, body which could handle the situation in a better way. Neither the Afghan government is in a position, to control the Afghan population. So to bring the Taliban to the Afghan government would be a good idea. However, we should always keep an eye, and that would be in terms of, pursuing them and engaging with them in a diplomatic way.
The United States is set to withdraw its troops, and Afghanistan is set to have a power-sharing agreement and a government composed of partly the Taliban for the first time in at least those 20 years. What is Afghanistan in 2021? How does it look today compared to 2001? And how is it a result of those 20 years? How has it shaped and influenced Afghanistani society today?
So if we compare, the Afghanistan in 2001 and now, there can be, mixed answer. For example, we would see certain level of materialistic development, which had to come by default, because it was, after all, 20 years. And in 2001, Afghanistan was recently recovering from the long-term war. It was also a 20-year war. Everything was demolished when the Soviet Union came to Afghanistan, and then the subsequent Mujahideen war. So the Taliban was a very nascent organization even by 2001. And I think if they were left to rule Afghanistan, I agree, there would be more conservative Afghanistan. However, there would be less casualties, and less people would have died. And the amount of money, which the US spent on its military operation in Afghanistan, had they been given to the Taliban, and they would, spend that in a responsible way, Afghanistan would be much more developed. And I think because of the 20-year time, the ideology of the Taliban would have also been changed. Because if we see the Taliban ideology now, especially of its leadership who are in Doha, they are, we will see a huge difference between their ideology. They are using social media. They are, conducting interviews, internationally. They also recognize the right of women to go to work. This was not the case back in 2001. And so why this all happened? Because of the time, because of the globalization. So we would have adopted, a soft policy power that would have worked much better than the military effort. And now in 2001, the Afghanistan is not going to be different from 2020 or 2019, because the situation is not, about the Taliban to stop the war. Of course, there is much more than, the war on the surface. People are suffering from poverty. People are suffering from unemployment. All those things take times. So we won't see any big difference, in the coming year.
Well, this is surely an unprecedented and exciting time for Afghanistan as it makes this transition. One question that I'd like to ask before we finish the conversation is actually when was the last time that you were in Afghanistan, and whether you could see yourself returning to live and work there one day in the future?
Well, I would say, this is the dream of every Afghan, who live abroad. Most of the Afghans, are always pushed from Afghanistan, especially by violence, not, for economic opportunities. And they would love to come back to their countries, work there, live peacefully there. It has always, a big dream of every Afghan, not even mine. And of course, I would love to see myself, serving the Afghan people if given the right opportunity and right time. And I hope it will happen.
I hope so too. I think despite all of the difficult things that we've been talking about today, the future could look bright for Afghanistan, and there could be an exciting way forward. Let's hope so.
Yeah, let's hope. That's the only way.
Irfan, thank you so much for joining me today at M.I.Cynic. We'd love to have you over another time to have another conversation about Afghanistan. There's really so much more that we can discuss. But for today and for this episode, we're going to have to call it a day. Thank you so much for taking part.
Really great talking to you. Thank you for having me again. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of M.I.Cynic. If you want to listen to our other episodes, leave your comments and feedback, or to support this project, please consider following us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and of course to check out our website at www.micynic.com. I hope to see you there for next time, and wish each of you a great rest of your week.